Morning, people. I think it's time we added up just how bad things have gotten in terms of the state of human rights in the UK since the Brexit vote in 2016. Because Home Secretary Suella Braverman and about a third of Tory MPs say they're going to push for the UK to leave the European Convention on Human Rights if the Supreme Court confirms that their plans to send refugees to Rwanda are illegal. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights, or the ECHR, is basically an agreed list of human rights that was drawn up by the Council of Europe in 1950. Now, the Council of Europe is not the same as the EU. Trust me, I know it's confusing because at university, I had to listen to a lecturer tell me this with a straight face. Now, class, remember, the Council of Europe has nothing to do with the EU. Hey, sir, what's the body within the EU that's made up of all the prime ministers and presidents of the EU countries? Oh, that's the European Council. Again, nothing to do with the Council of Europe, but hey, good luck in the exams. Now, the ECHR is an international treaty, so to make it apply in the UK, we passed the Human Rights Act, which is basically a copy and paste of the rights contained within the ECHR, which is why the Tories have always wanted to get rid of the Human Rights Act because they see it as a barrier to all their plans, for the same reasons they want out of the EU. Which is why I took Brexit so personally and had to start fighting it as soon as I heard about it. Because I knew nothing about UK politics in 2016, my passion and career were human rights. Because at the end of 2015, I was working for a little charity in Brussels that was pushing to get EU countries, which at the time included us, to have better human rights policies towards countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. For example, the UK was, and still is, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which we know they're using to bomb hospitals and schools in Yemen. And at the time, David Cameron was visiting the factories that were making the bombs that were being used for these war crimes and posing for photos. Meanwhile, I was working with British members of the European Parliament trying to push back against some of the horrendous stuff the Tories were doing, so I was already involved in what I thought was a battle for the soul of the UK that involved the EU and the Tories before I'd even heard of the word Brexit. Which is why when Brexit came onto the scene, it terrified me because I knew the Tories were already flirting with getting rid of the Human Rights Act, and being in the EU made that trickier because the Human Rights Act is the UK version of the ECHR. And even though the ECHR didn't come from the EU treaties adopted it as one of their general principles of EU law, so it guides how everything in the EU gets interpreted. And we were also protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in all the areas where the EU makes law. Not to mention, the general direction of the EU is geared towards equality, because equality on the grounds of sex, race, religion, disability, sexual orientation are listed as explicit aims in Article 19 of the functioning treaty. Basically, I started fighting Brexit because I knew the Tories would use it as fuel for their human rights bonfire, and that's exactly what we've seen since the Brexit vote. Let's start with the right to protest. They have officially violated that right. The Parliament's Committee on Human Rights found that the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, or the Policing Bill for short, breaches our right to protest because it gives too much discretion to police to decide whether somebody at a protest is shouting too loudly and arrest them for it if they don't quiet them down, with fines of up to £2,500. That was the verdict before it became law, and the Tories voted for it anyway. And just so we're all clear about how insane that is, that leaves it up to the personal judgment of whichever police officer happens to be on duty that day to decide whether the noise of your protest might make somebody nearby feel alarm or distress, which might include that they simply don't like what you're protesting for, and therefore more likely to feel distressed by it. Because we're not a quiet society. It's not like everybody at a football match or a pub or a concert feels distressed by the noise there. Whether loud noises distress us depends entirely on whether we like the noise or not, which means the legality of your protest can be decided after your protest based on whether the people hearing your protest like your protest. And just for the record, people who don't like your protest tend to be the people who most need to hear your protest. Add to that the public order bill and the laws that they rushed through just days before, and you get the scenes that we saw at the coronation. Like women's safety volunteers being arrested for 14 hours without charge simply because they tried to hand out rape alarms. And they were arrested by the Metropolitan Police, and given that the Met Police has recently been found to be institutionally sexist as well as homophobic and racist, not to mention the number of them that turn out to be murderous rapists, I wouldn't exactly trust them to make decisions on women's safety. But that's who the Tories decided to give free rein to suppress our human rights, and the Met Police have danced to the Tory tune gleefully. Before the coronation, they warned the entire country that they would have a low tolerance for protest, and that anybody who undermined the celebration would be dealt with. Meanwhile, we had government ministers on TV telling us that we should swear allegiance to the king. Can you hear the fascism? Because this was a public event, paid for using £100 million from the taxes that we pay during the sharpest rise in poverty ever recorded. And they were telling us that if we expressed anything other than blind allegiance to the king, the police would be after us. And they followed through. They arrested protesters who came with "Not My King" signs and confiscated the signs. They did so using their new laws against locking on. The Tories say that's because they don't want people padlocking themselves to gates and roads, but in this case, we're talking about the straps that the protesters used to hold the signs together during transport. And the police later admitted that there was no evidence of any plans to use these for any other purpose, so they released them without charge. And the police haven't just been cracking down on protesters, they've been doing what they've always done: disproportionately stopping and searching people from ethnic minorities. Which brings us to our next human right: equality. the right to be treated the same by those in power, and to have the same chance at achieving in life as everybody else. And that covers everything from the Tories' new plans that could see the welfare support of disabled people cut by up to £400 if they don't manage to reapply for personal independence payments, which has historically not been straightforward. It covers their use of an algorithm to decide the A-level grades of kids during the pandemic, which effectively took the best grades from state school kids and gave them to private school kids. The Tories knew it would do that. They were warned, but they stuck with it for months. And the government advisor on helping working class kids catch up after the pandemic quit because the Tories refused to spend enough money to help them. That was a human rights fuck up. Discrimination on the grounds of class is a human rights issue. Because we're all given this impression by the media that human rights is some lefty, metropolitan elite concern that's out of touch with the real needs of working class people. But the needs of working class people are a human rights issue. If somebody born in Barnsley has fewer opportunities in life than somebody born in Beaconsfield, that's a failure of equality. But the UK is one of the most regionally unequal major economies on the planet and has some of the worst income inequality on the planet, and both of those things have only gotten worse under the Get Brexit Done government. Especially because we have a Prime Minister who literally brags about defunding poor areas to help rich ones. You see, human rights are often expressed in terms of freedom. Freedom from torture, freedom from discrimination, freedom to vote, freedom to love who you want, freedom to identify how you want. But that includes freedom from poverty, because somebody in poverty is not free. If you have no time to really live, because you have to spend every waking minute scrambling to stay alive, you're not free. Because living paycheck to paycheck means there's a gun to your head at all times. So everything the Tories have done with the economy, trust crashing the pound, Brexit damaging our trade, both of which have made everything more expensive, from food to having a place to live, both of which are basic human necessities, that's been a human rights issue. Our inflation is worse than other similar economies, so our cost of living crisis is worse. Again, cost of living. Because these were decisions that were made, not acts of God, acts of politicians, to knowingly take away the basic necessities that we need to live. And with half of low-income families skipping meals to feed their kids, how is that not a human rights issue? And on the other kinds of equality, we've all seen the reports about how the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic, but the Tories have explicitly told them it's okay to be even more racist. The police were already stopping and searching black people 9 times more than white people, and that's despite the fact that their own data shows that white people were 24% more likely to have drugs on them when they're stopped and searched. So we already had a clear problem of police visually discriminating against black people, and yet Boris Johnson said
that the government is now putting back the emphasis on stop and search in our towns and in our cities, because I believe there's frankly nothing kinder or more loving than that you can do. If you see a young kid coming down the streets who may be carrying a knife, than to ask him to turn out, or her, but almost invariably him, to turn out his pockets and produce that knife. That is not discriminatory. That is a kind, compassionate, loving thing to do.
Translation: hey cops, I know you're already naturally targeting black people, but I think you really need to trust your gut even more. Really lean into that racial profiling you're doing. But they went even further, because the same policing act that attacked our right to protest also gave the police powers to stop and search people without having any reasonable ground to suspect that individual of committing a crime. And in the government's equality impact assessment, they actually admitted that this would disproportionately impact black people, but they said it was objectively justified. Now let's pause for a second on the fact that our government is saying that racial discrimination is objectively justified, because as bad as things get in this country, we can never let something like that just fly under the radar. Now the reason they say it's objectively justified is because of higher crime rates in neighborhoods that have a lot of black people. Now it's at this point that Tories, the right-wing press, and right-wing voters in general love to end the conversation. Like, well, there you have it. Black people are criminals, they say, so police should crack down on them more. But the Tories and the tabloids, they know the story doesn't stop there, but it benefits them to let their voters think it does. But for the record, that doesn't let the voters off the hook, because if they were decent people, they wouldn't sit comfortably with the idea that black people just like crime. And they'd ask themselves questions like, how many middle-class black people do you see carrying knives or committing other crimes? And if the answer is none, then maybe a person's skin color isn't the reason they commit crimes. And the government knows this. In their Beating Crime plan, they acknowledge the link between poverty, a lack of opportunity to escape poverty, and turning to crime. That's on the government website. So is the fact that black households are more likely than any other to have a weekly income of less than £600. And in their 2021 race report, they acknowledge that black people have to send between 65 and 90% more applications when applying for a job than white people. And that's based on experiments that were done using identical CVs where the only thing they changed was the name. So the government is very much aware that black people are more likely to be in poverty, and that it's up to 90% harder to get a job to escape that poverty. And then they use the stats that show that there's more crime happening in poor areas to say that it's justified to tell their police to crack down more on black people. And they buttoned it off by telling teachers that it's illegal to teach kids about white privilege. You know, the situation where society puts barriers in the way of people from ethnic minorities that it doesn't put in the way of white people. And given that the first step to fixing a problem is to acknowledge that it exists, Banning people from learning that it exists is the definition of institutional racism, because it's the government's own data that shows the problem, but are they doing anything to fix it? Are they making anonymous CVs mandatory, or at least encouraging them using tax benefits? And by the way, anonymous CVs wouldn't just tackle racial discrimination, it would also tackle discrimination on the basis of class, gender, region, because employers wouldn't be able to see where in the country you come from or whether you went to a posh school. They'd just see your qualifications, your experience, and your cover letter. But the Tories have no interest in fighting inequality. They're just painting a target on black people's backs, calling it justified, and then denying the existence of institutional racism. I mean, there was a wild moment last year where the government published proposals to confiscate the passports and driver's licenses of people who use drugs. Now, even though the police stats say that white people are 24% more likely to have drugs on them when they're stopped and searched, because black people are stopped and searched 7 times more than white people, that will still mean a lot more black people without photo ID. Meanwhile, at the same time, they passed laws that said that you could only vote if you had photo ID. But again, no such thing as institutional racism. And that brings us to the right to vote, because I find it insane that every news channel isn't playing this clip at least once a week to remind people just how much of a joke our democracy is.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. And we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters.
The Tories were warned by everybody across the board, from human rights groups to Tory MPs like David Davis, that their plans to require people to show photo ID when voting would lead to thousands of people being unable to vote on the day. And what happened in the last local election? 14,000 people were turned away when they tried to vote. And the Tories wanted that to mainly impact young people who might not have a driver's license or a passport yet. But as Jacob Rees-Mogg explained, it backfired. But it's still a human rights violation. Besides, his party is only in power because they refused to let 16-year-olds vote at the last election because...
when we know it'll probably favour one particular party, now's not the right time to do it.
Deciding who gets to vote based on who they would vote for if we let them is full-fat fascism. I mean, things were already bad. Under our current voting system, most votes don't count because a party that only a minority voted for always gets majority control in parliament. So none of the other parties can stop them from doing anything, even though the majority of the people voted for those other parties. So the majority of the votes have no effect on our policies. And the Elections Act that they passed last year extended that broken system, first past the post, to mayoral elections as well, to make sure the Tories won those too. Because they aren't even hiding how much they hate democracy anymore. Conservative member of the House of Lords, Peter Cruddas, literally said that if all votes counted equally, the Tories would never have power again.
If Labour wins a big majority at the next election, they will reduce the voting age to 16, they will abolish voter ID, and they will introduce proportional representation, making it almost impossible for the Conservatives to win an outright majority in the future.
Dominic Raab said that a proportional voting system is a real threat to the Conservative Party.
One referendum on electoral reform, the other a referendum to break up this great United Kingdom of ours. That threat is real.
They've gone out of their way to make it really clear to us that basic human rights and dignity are their enemy, which brings us to the right to asylum. The year we left the EU, the Tory Home Secretary, Priti Patel, said the Tory party stands against human rights lawyers and people who do good in general.
The traffickers, the do-gooders, the lefty lawyers, the Labour Party. They are defending the indefensible.
Using do-gooders as an insult is some cartoon villain shit. And for the record, when she says traffickers, she means the people smugglers who help asylum seekers to get here. Because human traffickers are actually huge fans of the Tory party's policy on this. Because Rishi Sunak has literally said that we will not help the victims of modern slavery if they come here without permission. And their main policy for dealing with the crisis of people needing refuge is to send them to Rwanda. And the Court of Appeal has said that that policy is unlawful due to minor safety concerns like Rwanda's history of genocide and shooting refugees who demand to be fed properly. And while I was filming this, the other main plan for dealing with refugees, housing them on a floating barge, hit a minor speed bump because they found deadly bacteria in the water system. And all of this is being done supposedly to act as a deterrent to stop people from coming here without permission. So for starters, you are punishing the most vulnerable people on the planet for daring to ask for our help. Second of all, the Home Secretary was asked how people are meant to get here to claim asylum, and she basically said, well, illegally, of course.
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
But I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
So the 6 asylum seekers who were found dead in the Channel this morning, they were following her advice. But thirdly, the right to claim asylum in any country is a human right recognized in the Refugee Convention, which we signed. But the Tories are doing this on the basis that they're not real refugees if they pass through safe countries to get here, which means that people in Yemen will never be able to claim asylum in the UK until the landmass of Yemen literally swims its way to Portsmouth. Because apparently geography is what determines our moral responsibility, not the fact that we're selling weapons that are being used to kill civilians in Yemen. So last year we told refugees from Yemen that they should go back to Yemen while bombs that were made in the UK were still falling in Yemen. That feels like murder to me. But this government thinks the lives of anybody they consider to be foreign don't matter. And even if you're not foreign, they'll make you foreign. Which brings us to citizenship rights. The Nationality and Borders Act of 2022 gives the Home Secretary the power to remove our citizenship without notice if they consider that we're not conducive to the public good. They basically used Shamima Begum to soften the public up to the idea. It's a classic strategy. You point to the human rights of somebody that people really don't like, and you say, well, they shouldn't be treated nicely, and people accept it. Even though in Shamima Begum's case, we're talking about somebody who was groomed by terrorists at the age of 15, which means the people who want her to be punished like this actually have a lot in common with ISIS, because both of them seem to think that a 15-year-old girl should be treated as an adult capable of consenting to marry a fully grown man. But there's a reason why we call them human rights, because they're supposed to apply to everybody who classifies as human, specifically to avoid us removing them from people that we don't like. Because that's how the Overton window shifts, the Overton window being the range of things that are acceptable within politics. One politician does something really bad which would normally be considered outside of that range, but if there are no real consequences for it, or worse still, if they're rewarded for it, then things shift further and further in that direction. And the Tories have been doing that since the Brexit vote in 2016. The moment they established the principle that whatever relationship they negotiated with the EU to replace our membership was automatically the will of the people, they had our politics by the throat, and they could turn its head whichever way they wanted. It's textbook populism. You decide what you want to do, and then you claim that it's what the people want to do. And they've used this technique with the Rwanda policy, with stopping the boats, and now with leaving the ECHR. Gotta get rid of those nasty European laws. And the worst thing is, the weakness on the left has allowed them to shift the Overton window further and further to the right. Because we have a two-party system, but both of the recent Labour leaders felt they needed to adopt the flagship policies of the right to chase their voters. Both Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer have supported Brexit for years. They've both catered to the anti-immigration ideology of the Tories by promising to end free movement. And on social issues, it's hard to see a difference between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. He hasn't even tried to question the Tory narrative that the biggest problem people are facing right now is the burden of asylum seekers. But worst of all, he's still supporting a first-past-the-post voting system that has delivered Tory governments for 48 of the last 78 years, despite the majority consistently voting to the left of them. And this is where we are after 7 years in Brexit land under the Tories. Protest rights dying, voting rights dying, asylum rights dying, citizenship rights dying, workers' rights dying, equality rights dying, and the opposition refusing to provide life support. The reason I started fighting Brexit in 2016 was because I feared what the Tories would do with human rights afterwards. I really don't like being right. I'm Femi. Have a great week.